January 17th, 1945, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 5:30 hours. The fog hung low between the fir trees like a dirty wool blanket, muffling the sound of boots crunching through crusted snow. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter crouched beside the overturned Kubelwagen, its rear axle buried axle-deep in frozen mud, the vehicle's angular silhouette tilted at an obscene angle against the grey morning. Steam rose from beneath the hood in thin wisps. The engine had died 20 minutes ago. Around him, 3 other men from his supply company worked in silence, their breath visible in ragged clouds, shoulders hunched against the cold that had settled into their bones like an unwelcome tenant. Richter's hands were numb inside his gloves. He could smell pine resin and diesel fuel and the metallic tang of fear that had become so familiar it no longer registered as unusual. In the distance, maybe 3 kilometers west, he could hear the rumble of engines, American engines, deeper and steadier than anything the Wehrmacht possessed anymore. The sound grew closer with each passing minute. Richter looked down at the Kubelwagen's narrow tires, barely wider than a man's hand, spinning uselessly in the slush. The vehicle that was supposed to embody German engineering efficiency, lightweight and economical, now sat immobilized by the same terrain that had swallowed so many of their tanks, half-tracks and supply trucks in the past month. He thought about the manual he'd memorized during training in 1943, the one that praised the Kubelwagen's minimal ground pressure and fuel economy. None of those words meant anything now. The forest trail they'd been following had turned to soup overnight as temperatures rose just enough to melt the top layer of ice. Beneath that, the ground remained frozen solid. It was the worst possible combination, a surface that looked passable but collapsed under even modest weight. 200 meters down that same trail, concealed by the morning mist, Corporal James Whitmore sat behind the wheel of a Willys MB Jeep, waiting for his lieutenant to finish studying a map. The Jeep's engine idled with a steady mechanical heartbeat that Whitmore had come to find oddly comforting. He wasn't thinking about the German supply column they'd been tracking. He was thinking about how, 20 minutes earlier, they'd driven straight through a stream crossing that should have been impassable. The water coming up past the floorboards, cold as a knife, and how the Jeep had simply climbed out the other side without hesitation. All 4 wheels clawing for purchase and finding it. He'd done things in this vehicle over the past 8 months that would have been impossible in any car he'd ever driven back in Pennsylvania. Climbed slopes that looked vertical, forded rivers, pulled artillery pieces through mud that swallowed men to their knees. The Jeep didn't care. It just went. This was the reality that no pre-war strategist had fully anticipated, that modern warfare would ultimately be decided not by the elegance of tank design or the speed of fighter aircraft, but by the humble ability to move supplies, reinforcements, and communications across terrible ground at terrible times. The difference between a vehicle that could traverse 15 kilometers of broken forest trail in 20 minutes and one that couldn't traverse 500 meters would prove more consequential than a dozen pitched battles. This was the mathematics of logistics made visible, the cold arithmetic that determined which army could sustain offensive operations and which would starve in place, surrounded by the wreckage of its own ambitions. The philosophy of mobility, when Ferdinand Porsche's engineering team designed the Kubelwagen in 1938, they approached the problem of military transport with a distinctly German mindset, one shaped by decades of engineering tradition that prized elegance, efficiency, and theoretical optimization. The Type 82, as it was officially designated, emerged from the same design philosophy that had produced the Volkswagen Beetle. It was rear-engined, air-cooled, lightweight at just 1,520 pounds empty. The logic was impeccable on paper. Reduce weight to minimize ground pressure. Use a proven civilian engine architecture to simplify maintenance. Employ rear-wheel drive to eliminate the complexity and weight of a front differential. In the proving grounds near Stuttgart, on groomed dirt roads and controlled terrain, the Kubelwagen performed admirably. It could carry 4 men and their equipment at speeds up to 80 kilometers per hour on paved roads. It consumed only 9 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers. These were the metrics that mattered to planners who still imagined war as something that happened on roads, or at least on ground that resembled roads. The engineers had never driven through the Pripyat marshes. They had never attempted to navigate the spring Rasputitsa of Ukraine, where the black earth turned to a substance that was neither liquid nor solid, but something worse than both. They had never tried to climb the rocky slopes of Tunisia's Kasserine Pass or force their way through the root-choked forest tracks of the Hurtgen. The Kubelwagen's narrow tires, designed to minimize rolling resistance, acted like knives on soft ground, cutting down through mud and snow rather than floating across it. The rear-wheel drive configuration meant that only 2 wheels provided motive power, and when those wheels lost traction, the vehicle simply stopped. There was no mechanical differential lock in early models, so if one rear wheel lifted off the ground or encountered significantly less resistance than the other, all engine power transferred to the spinning wheel, while the one with traction sat motionless. Physics didn't care about engineering elegance. In contrast, when the American Quartermaster Corps issued its requirements for a quarter-ton reconnaissance vehicle in 1940, the specifications read like a wish list written by men who had never designed a car. The vehicle must weigh under 300 pounds, carry a 600-pound payload, traverse rough terrain, climb a 60-degree slope, and be simple enough that any farm boy with a wrench could maintain it. The military wanted something that probably couldn't exist. 3 companies submitted prototypes: Willys Overland, Ford, and American Bantam. What emerged through rapid competitive development was a vehicle that shouldn't have worked as well as it did. The Willys MB Jeep weighed 2,550 pounds fully equipped, nearly double the weight of the Kubelwagen, but that weight was distributed across 4 driven wheels, not 2. The part-time 4-wheel drive system could be engaged with a simple floor-mounted lever, splitting engine torque between front and rear axles. Ground clearance measured 8.75 inches. The wheelbase was 80 inches, short enough to be nimble, but long enough to provide stability. The tires were 6 bogged to 16-inch military non-directionals, wide and soft, designed to conform to terrain rather than cut through it. But specifications only told part of the story. The real difference lay in design philosophy itself. German engineers had optimized for efficiency within expected parameters. American engineers had overbuilt for the unexpected. The Jeep's frame was unnecessarily heavy by civilian standards. Its suspension components were twice as robust as automotive practice would suggest. The engine, a 2.2-liter inline-4 producing only 60 horsepower, was understressed and nearly indestructible as a result. When thousands of Jeeps began rolling off assembly lines in Toledo and Detroit in 1941, they carried within their mechanical DNA a peculiarly American assumption that the world was an obstacle course, not a highway, and that success belonged to whatever could simply refuse to quit. It was in the Soviet Union that the Kubelwagen's limitations became most apparent and most consequential. The Rasputitsa, the twice-yearly mud season that turned Ukraine's black earth into bottomless porridge, had destroyed more German vehicles than Soviet guns. During the spring of 1942, entire mechanized divisions found themselves immobilized. Their vehicles sunk to the axles in mud that could swallow a Kubelwagen's narrow tires completely. Soldiers would spend hours digging, placing logs and branches under the wheels, pushing with their bodies, only to watch the vehicle sink again after moving 3 meters. The rear-wheel drive configuration that worked adequately on solid ground became a fatal flaw in the mud. With only 2 wheels trying to propel the vehicle forward, and those 2 wheels receiving unequal traction, the Kubelwagen would simply dig itself deeper, Gefreiter Otto Kumm, serving with the 18th Panzer Division during the approach to Stalingrad. Recorded in his memoirs, "We abandoned 4 Kubelwagens in a single afternoon, all within a 2-kilometer stretch of what the maps called a road." The mud wasn't dramatic. It didn't look impossible. It looked like mud. But beneath the surface was something else. A kind of suction that grabbed the wheels. First contact, North Africa. 1942, the Germans encountered American jeeps for the first time in meaningful numbers during the campaigns in Tunisia, and the experience was instructive. Lieutenant Heinrich Müller, commanding a reconnaissance platoon of the 10th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter dated March 1943 that would later be captured near Mejez el Bab. We observed American patrols operating in terrain we considered impassable. Their small vehicles move across the rocky wadis like goats. Yesterday we pursued one for 7 kilometers. It led us through a stream bed across a field of stones that shattered 2 of our Kubelwagen suspensions and then simply drove up a slope we would have needed climbing equipment to ascend on foot. We lost sight of it. This is not the American army we were told to expect. Müller's observation wasn't isolated. After-action reports from North Africa repeatedly mentioned the jeep's unsettling mobility. German forces, accustomed to thinking of reconnaissance as something conducted on roads or firm desert, found themselves outmaneuvered by American units that treated roads as suggestions. The jeep's 4-wheel drive meant it could operate in sand that would bog down the Kubelwagen's rear wheels within seconds. Its short wheelbase and torquey low-range gearing allowed it to climb rocky terrain that looked impossible. The 6 0-16 tires, running at reduced pressure, could float across surfaces where the Kubelwagen's narrower tires would sink. Captured German intelligence assessments from April 1943 noted that American reconnaissance elements were achieving penetration depths 30 to 40% greater than equivalent German units. Not through superior tactics, but through superior mobility. The vehicle itself was changing what was possible, but it wasn't just reconnaissance. The jeep's versatility revealed itself in roles that no pre-war planner had imagined. They became ambulances, carrying wounded men strapped to hood-mounted stretchers back through terrain no ambulance could navigate. They became gun platforms, fitted with pedestal-mounted 30 and 50 caliber machine guns. They became artillery tractors, towing 37mm anti-tank guns and even the much heavier 105mm howitzers in emergencies. They became command posts, signal relay stations, wire-laying vehicles and ammunition carriers. A single jeep with a skilled driver could replace 3 specialized vehicles, and it could do so in places where specialized vehicles couldn't reach at all. This adaptability was itself a form of overwhelming force. Oberst Friedrich Weber, serving with Panzer Army Africa's logistics staff, wrote in his diary in May 1943, 3 weeks before the Axis surrender in Tunisia, the Americans waste vehicles the way we conserve ammunition. Today, I watch through field glasses as an American supply column, at least 40 of their small trucks, drove cross-country to bypass a section of road we had mined. They simply left the road, drove 3 kilometers through open desert, and rejoined the highway beyond our obstacles. The entire detour took perhaps 15 minutes. When we must move supplies off-road, it requires half a day of preparation, engineer support, and careful route selection. They do it on impulse. This is not inefficiency. This is a kind of wealth we cannot counter with tactics. Weber had identified something crucial. The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. It was a manifestation of American industrial philosophy made mobile, where German doctrine emphasized specialized vehicles for specialized tasks, each optimized, each carefully allocated. American doctrine increasingly embraced standardization and overwhelming numerical superiority. The Jeep could be mediocre at many things and still be more valuable than vehicles that were excellent at one thing. Between 1941 and 1945, American industry would produce 647-925 Jeeps of various models. Germany would produce approximately 50,000 Kubelwagens across the entire war. This 9-to-1 numerical advantage meant that American units could afford to use Jeeps cavalierly, even wastefully, in ways that German units, carefully husbanding every vehicle, could never match. The Eastern Front, mud and ideology and wouldn't release. The harder the engine worked, the deeper the vehicle settled. We learned to walk beside our vehicles before driving them, testing the ground with sticks, feeling for firmness. Even then we guessed wrong half the time. The Russians seemed to understand this mud in a way we couldn't. We would see their trucks, American trucks, moving on parallel tracks 100 meters away, not faster but steadily, never stopping. It made us angry in a way that combat didn't. Combat was something you could fight. Mud was just mud, and it was defeating us. The American trucks, Cum observed, were likely Studebaker US-6 2.5-ton trucks supplied through Lend-Lease. But Soviet forces also received approximately 50,000 Jeeps over the course of the war. Soviet commanders quickly grasped the Jeep's utility in their unique environment. The combination of four-wheel drive, high ground clearance, and wide tires made the Jeep one of the few wheeled vehicles that could maintain mobility during the Rasputitsa, when almost everything else stopped moving. Soviet cavalry divisions, still a significant part of the Red Army's order of battle in 1942 and 1943, began using Jeeps as mechanized scouts, precisely because they could operate in terrain where trucks bogged down and tanks consumed fuel too rapidly. The Jeep became a favorite mount of Soviet reconnaissance battalions, political officers, and partisan coordinators operating behind German lines, where roads were rare and mud was constant. German soldiers noticed. Stabsfeldwebel Werner Hartmann, captured near Kursk in July 1943, told his NKVD interrogators something that appeared in the intelligence summary circulated to Red Army staff officers. "The small American car is better than our Kubelwagen in every way except fuel economy. It goes where ours cannot. It carries more. It pulls small guns. You can repair it with a hammer." Our men preferred to capture an American car than almost any other vehicle. This bothered us more than we admitted. We were supposed to have the best equipment. We were told German engineering was superior. But when you are stuck in mud up to your waist, trying to dig out your vehicle for the third time that day, and you watch one of their cars simply drive past you through the same mud, you stop believing what you were told. This crisis of belief was precisely what worried German leadership, though they rarely articulated it directly. National Socialist ideology rested partly on the assertion of German technical and organizational superiority. The propaganda machinery had spent years depicting Germany as a nation of engineers and soldiers, disciplined and advanced, facing decadent democracies and barbaric Bolsheviks who succeeded only through numbers and brutality, never through excellence. But the Jeep contradicted that narrative in a way that was difficult to explain away. It was demonstrably superior to its German equivalent in the conditions that actually mattered. It had been designed and built by the same American industrial system that Nazi ideology dismissed as Jewish-controlled, mongrelized, and obsessed with profit over quality. Yet here was this stubborn little vehicle, outperforming the products of German engineering in the mud of Russia, the sand of North Africa, and the mountains of Italy. Propaganda Minister Goebbels never directly addressed the Jeep in his public statements, but internal Nazi Party correspondence reveals awareness of the problem. A memo from the Propaganda Ministry to Wehrmacht public relations officers, dated November 1943, instructed, "Reports from the front should emphasize German technical achievements and avoid detailed comparisons with enemy equipment that might lead to unfavorable conclusions. Soldiers' letters mentioning superior enemy vehicles should be discouraged from publication," the instruction was telling. By late 1943, the regime recognized that the material reality of the war was undermining ideological certainty, and vehicles, humble and glamorous vehicles, were part of that corrosion. The symbolism of abundance. By 1944, the Jeep had become more than transportation. It had become a symbol recognized by soldiers on all sides as representing something essential about American power. That symbol wasn't firepower or tactical brilliance. It was abundance, The terrifying, incomprehensible abundance of an industrial system that could produce machines by the hundreds of thousands and scatter them across 3 continents as if they cost nothing. German soldiers who encountered American supply depots, either during retreats or in captured photographs, were stunned by the sheer quantity of material. Jeeps parked in rows that stretched for hundreds of meters, tires stacked in pyramids 3 stories high, engine blocks waiting for assembly, arranged with a casualness that suggested they were disposable. Unteroffizier Franz Becker, captured during the Falaise Pocket in August 1944, walked through a captured American supply dump near Argentan before being sent to a POW camp. He later described the experience to a British intelligence officer. "I saw vehicles parked so closely together you could barely walk between them. Hundreds, maybe thousands. I stopped counting. Some were damaged, bent fenders, broken windscreens, but they were still there, waiting to be repaired or cannibalized for parts. We would have stripped those vehicles to the frame and rebuilt them. The Americans just left them sitting. There was a Jeep with a blown engine, just abandoned beside a tent. The tires were good. The body was intact. At home, that vehicle would have been rebuilt within a week and returned to service. Here, no one even looked at it. This was when I understood we had lost the war. Not because of that one Jeep, but because of what it represented. They had so many vehicles they could afford not to care about one. This abundance was strategic. American logistics doctrine in World War II operated on the principle of redundancy, having not just enough, but more than enough, so that local shortages or losses wouldn't disrupt operations. Every infantry division was authorized 588 Jeeps. Armored divisions had 653. But beyond those allocations, theater commands maintained vast pools of replacement vehicles. If a unit lost 20 Jeeps in combat, 20 more would arrive within days, sometimes hours. This meant that American commanders could plan operations without worrying whether they'd have enough vehicles to execute them. They could accept losses that would cripple a German unit and simply replace them. The Jeep had become a commodity, as interchangeable and disposable as ammunition. German logistics operated under opposite assumptions. The Kubelwagen was a limited resource, carefully allocated, meticulously maintained. Units reported their vehicle status daily. Losses required justification. Mechanics worked miracles keeping vehicles operational long past their designed service life, cannibalizing parts from wrecked vehicles, improvising repairs with materials that would have horrified factory engineers. This culture of scarcity produced extraordinary mechanical skill and ingenuity, but it couldn't overcome simple arithmetic. By late 1944, many Wehrmacht units were operating at 30 or 40% of their authorized vehicle strength. They couldn't move supplies fast enough to sustain operations. They couldn't evacuate wounded quickly enough to save lives. They couldn't reposition forces rapidly enough to respond to Allied breakthroughs. The paralysis wasn't tactical, it was logistical. They were starving for mobility while their opponents drowned in it. The Jeep also represented a different relationship between soldier and machine. In the Wehrmacht, vehicles were state property, treated with formal respect and careful handling. There were regulations about proper starting procedures, acceptable load limits, mandatory maintenance intervals. Soldiers who damaged vehicles through negligence faced punishment. This created a culture where vehicles were handled cautiously, almost deferentially. The Jeep, by contrast, was abused with an abandon that shocked German observers. American soldiers overloaded them, drove them recklessly, jumped them over obstacles, used them in ways that violated every principle of mechanical sympathy. And the Jeeps survived. They survived because they'd been built by engineers who assumed soldiers would mistreat them and designed accordingly. The gap between theoretical performance and actual durability was enormous. This was American pragmatism made mechanical. Build it tough enough that skill doesn't matter, make it simple enough that anyone can fix it, produce enough that losses are irrelevant. The Hürtgen Forest, machines in hell. The Hürtgen Forest, in autumn 1944, became a graveyard for vehicles on both sides. But the contrast in how American and German forces handled vehicular losses revealed the deeper truth about logistics warfare. The forest trails, narrow, muddy, chewed to pieces by artillery and tracked vehicles, were barely passable even in good conditions. When autumn rains arrived in October, they became nearly impassable. Kubelwagens attempting to deliver supplies or evacuate wounded would bog down within minutes of leaving paved roads. German supply officers resorted to using horses and handcarts, methods that would have seemed appropriate in 1914. The Wehrmacht's motorized army was reduced to pre-industrial logistics by terrain and weather. American forces faced the same terrain but responded differently. Jeeps, engaged in four-wheel drive with tire pressures dropped to 10 psi, could negotiate trails that stopped everything else. They couldn't do it gracefully. Drivers would spend hours grinding through mud, winching themselves forward using trees as anchor points, building corduroy roads from logs to cross the worst sections. But they could do it. More importantly, when jeeps were lost to mines, artillery, or simply terminal mechanical failure, they were replaced. The replacement cycle was so routine, it barely rated mention in unit records. Vehicle destroyed on October 12th. Replacement arrived October 14th. This continuity of equipment meant that American units in the Hürtgen maintained their mobility. Degraded, difficult, but present, while German units lost theirs entirely. Oberst Gerhard Wilk, commander of the 246th Volksgrenadier Division defending Hürtgen, wrote in his November 1944 situation reports, "Enemy mobility in wooded terrain far exceeds our own. Their small vehicles can navigate trails we consider impassable. This grants them tactical flexibility we cannot match. They can reinforce threatened sectors, evacuate casualties, and bring forward ammunition while our supply lines are limited to what men can carry. We are defending from static positions, not by choice, but by necessity. We lack the mobility to do otherwise." The jeep's role as an ambulance became particularly significant in the Hürtgen's nightmarish conditions. The forest fighting produced casualties at rates approaching World War I intensity, horrific wounds from tree bursts, traumatic amputations from mines, exposure injuries from men lying wounded in cold mud for hours. The ability to get wounded men to aid stations quickly made the difference between survival and death. Jeeps fitted with litter racks could carry 4 wounded men and reach battalion aid stations in 20 to 30 minutes across terrain that would take stretcher bearers 2 hours to traverse. The German wounded, by contrast, often waited hours for evacuation, carried by hand through mud and shell fire because vehicles couldn't reach them. This wasn't just humanitarian concern. It was a force multiplier. American soldiers knew that if they were hit, a jeep would come for them. German soldiers increasingly suspected they'd be left behind. Private First Class Robert Jackson, a medic with the 4th Infantry Division, later wrote about his experiences in the Hürtgen. "We'd load the worst cases on the jeep, the ones who couldn't wait, the ones who'd die if they didn't get to surgery within the hour. I rode in back with them, holding plasma bottles, pressing on wounds, talking to them to keep them conscious. The driver would just go, didn't matter what was in the way. Trees, shell craters, mud 3 feet deep. The jeep would claw through it. Took maybe 25 minutes to reach the aid station on trips that should have been impossible. I stopped thinking about the vehicle and started thinking about it like a living thing, something stubborn and mean that refused to quit because quitting wasn't in its nature. Saved probably 100 men that way. The jeep saved them, really. We were just along for the ride, engineering philosophy as national character. The divergence between the Kubelwagen and the jeep reflected deeper differences in national engineering philosophies that had roots extending back decades before the war. German engineering tradition, emerging from late 19th century industrialization, emphasized theoretical optimization, precise calculation, and elegant solutions. It was engineering as applied mathematics, define the problem rigorously, solve for optimal parameters, manufacture to exact specifications. This approach produced remarkable achievements. Diesel engines that could run for hundreds of thousands of kilometers, machine tools accurate to microns, synthetic materials created through chemical processes that seemed like alchemy. But it also produced a certain brittleness. German designs often performed brilliantly within their design parameters and failed catastrophically outside them. American engineering culture, shaped by vast distances, rough conditions, and chronic labor shortages, had evolved differently. It emphasized robustness over refinement, maintainability over sophistication, redundancy over optimization. American engineers assumed that things would be used wrong, maintained poorly, and pushed beyond their rated limits, so they built in margins that European engineers would consider wasteful. The Jeep's frame, for instance, was heavier than structural analysis required. A European engineer might have reduced it by 15% and saved 75 pounds. But that extra 75 pounds meant the frame could handle years of abuse that would crack an optimized structure. This philosophy of deliberate overbuilding extended throughout American military equipment. It was why American vehicles could be maintained by conscripts with minimal training, why they could run on low-grade fuel, why they could survive mistakes that would destroy their German counterparts. The difference showed in maintenance requirements. The Kubelwagen's air-cooled engine required precise valve adjustments every few hundred kilometers. The cooling fan belt needed regular tension checks. The reduction gearing in the rear hubs, an elegant solution to providing low-range torque without a transfer case, required specialized tools and knowledge to service. A well-maintained Kubelwagen operated by skilled personnel was a reliable machine. But under field conditions, with exhausted mechanics, limited tools and no spare parts, reliability degraded rapidly. German maintenance units were staffed with trained specialists who understood their vehicles intimately. When those specialists were killed, wounded, or simply exhausted beyond effectiveness, the vehicles they maintained began to fail. The Jeep was designed to be maintained by men who'd never seen an engine before being drafted. The manual that came with every vehicle was written in simple language, with clear illustrations, assuming no prior mechanical knowledge. Most repairs required only basic tools, wrenches, pliers, a hammer. The engine's side valve design was technologically obsolete by 1940 standards, but extraordinarily simple and robust. You could see how it worked just by looking at it. Soldiers who'd been farmers learned to fix Jeeps using the same intuitive mechanical sense they'd developed repairing tractors. This democratization of maintenance meant that American units maintained high operational readiness rates even under terrible conditions. The vehicles didn't need specialists. They needed willing hands and basic intelligence. This philosophical difference had political dimensions that neither side fully acknowledged during the war. The German emphasis on specialization, hierarchy, and expertise reflected a broader cultural pattern that National Socialism had emphasized: the importance of natural hierarchy, the idea that some men were meant to lead and others to follow, that technical knowledge was the province of educated elites. The Jeep's idiot-proof design reflected American assumptions about democracy and equality, the belief that ordinary men, given adequate tools and clear instructions, could accomplish extraordinary things without requiring supervision from experts or aristocrats. These were political philosophies encoded in machinery, fighting a proxy war through logistics. The race for the Rhine, mobility as destiny in the summer of 1944. After the Normandy breakout, the war became a race. Allied forces were attempting to reach and cross the Rhine before German defenses could solidify. The Germans were attempting to delay that advance long enough to establish coherent defensive lines. Both objectives depended fundamentally on mobility, the ability to move supplies, reinforcements, and headquarters elements faster than the enemy. This race would demonstrate conclusively that the Jeep wasn't just a better vehicle than the Kubelwagen. It was a strategic weapon that changed what was possible. General George Patton's Third Army covered distances in August 1944 that seemed impossible by World War II standards. Entire divisions advanced 80 to 100 kilometers in single days, not by fighting, but by simply driving. This was possible because American logistics could keep up. Jeeps carried forward reconnaissance elements, established road control points, guided follow-on forces, delivered orders, evacuated wounded, and performed 1,000 other tasks that made rapid movement possible. When supply lines stretched thin, as they did during Patton's dash toward Metz, jeeps became improvised cargo carriers. The Red Ball Express, the famous supply convoy system that sustained Allied armies after Normandy, relied partly on jeeps fitted with trailers to deliver supplies to forward units when larger trucks couldn't reach them. The Germans, retreating across France, attempted to use distance as a defensive weapon. They would establish blocking positions, delay American advances for hours or days, then retreat to the next defensible line before being encircled. This strategy required mobility to work, the ability to disengage, displace, and re-establish defenses faster than the enemy advanced. But they lacked the vehicles to execute it. Wehrmacht units in France were chronically short of transportation. Many divisions moved on foot, at the speed of marching men, while their opponents moved at the speed of engines. The Kubelwagens they did possess were increasingly reserved for critical command and control functions because there were so few of them. Meanwhile, American forces were using jeeps for everything from serious military purposes to beer runs. Because they had 15 where they needed 10, General Major Rudolf Freiherr von Gersdorff, serving as Chief of Staff to the 7th Army during the retreat across France, later wrote, "We were retreating faster than our feet could carry us, but not faster than American vehicles could pursue. Time and again, we would establish a defensive position, prepare to hold for 24 or 48 hours, and find American reconnaissance vehicles probing our flanks within 6 hours of our arrival. They seemed to travel faster than information, appearing in places before we had time to warn units that they were coming. This created a psychological pressure beyond the tactical implications. Our men began to feel hunted, as if there were eyes everywhere, American eyes on wheels that could materialize on any road at any moment. That psychological pressure was itself a form of combat power. German units never felt secure because American mobility meant nowhere was truly beyond reach. A battalion trying to rest in a village 10 kilometers behind the front would be startled by jeep-mounted reconnaissance patrols that had simply driven through holes in the German line, navigating cross-country, appearing where they shouldn't exist. These patrols rarely accomplished anything dramatic. They'd observe, report, and withdraw, but their presence created a pervasive anxiety. The Americans could be anywhere. This sense of omnipresent threat degraded German unit cohesion and decision-making in ways that were difficult to quantify, but nonetheless real. Winter, 1944. The bulge and breaking points. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944, Germany's last major attack in the West, was partly conceived as an attempt to exploit weather conditions that might neutralize American mobility advantages. The plan assumed that snow, ice, and fog would ground American aircraft and slow American vehicles, giving German forces a temporary window of tactical parity. For the first few days, the assumption held. Heavy snow and bitter cold created difficult conditions for all vehicles. Jeeps struggled through deep snow and icy roads just as Kubelwagens did. But the struggle was different in character and consequence. American units, surprised and sometimes overrun, retained their mobility even in chaos. Small groups cut off by German advances used jeeps to escape encirclement, driving cross-country through snow-covered forests, navigating by compass, finding their way back to friendly lines. Jeeps became lifeboats for retreating units, carrying ammunition and wounded forward to surrounded positions like Bastogne, then evacuating casualties on the return journey. The vehicle's four-wheel drive meant it could maintain traction on icy slopes, where rear-wheel drive vehicles spun helplessly. Its ground clearance allowed it to push through snowdrifts that would high-center a Kubelwagen. German forces, despite initial successes, found their mobility degrading rapidly as they advanced. The roads they captured were clogged with American vehicles and refugees, yes, but more fundamentally, they lacked the fuel and vehicles to exploit their breakthroughs. Panzer divisions that had attacked with 80 or 90 tanks found themselves down to 20 or 30 within a week. Not all from combat losses, but from mechanical breakdowns and fuel exhaustion that left vehicles abandoned along roadsides. The Kubelwagens attached to these divisions suffered similarly. They'd been designed for economy, not for sustained operations in deep snow at extreme low temperatures. Engines that struggled to start in -20-degree cold. Fuel lines that froze. Batteries that died overnight. The vehicles simply weren't robust enough for the conditions they encountered. American Jeeps faced the same cold, but their overbuilt nature provided margins that mattered. The 2.2-liter engine, understressed and simple, would start reluctantly but eventually fire. The 6-volt electrical system was primitive by 1944 standards but reliable. Most critically, there were enough Jeeps that units could afford to have some out of action for cold weather starting difficulties, while others continued to operate. The numerical advantage meant that local failures didn't cascade into systemic breakdown. German forces didn't have that margin. When a Kubelwagen failed to start, there often wasn't another one available to take its place. Sergeant William Keller, with the 101st Airborne Division in Bastogne, later recalled, "We'd hear the Germans trying to start their vehicles in the morning. You could hear their starters grinding, engines coughing but not catching, then silence. Our Jeeps were cold-natured too, but with enough cranking and some starting fluid, they'd eventually run. Once they were running, they stayed running. We learned to keep them idling whenever possible, wasting fuel but ensuring they'd be ready. The Germans apparently couldn't afford to do that. Or maybe they just didn't have enough fuel. Either way, we'd be moving before dawn, while they were still trying to get their vehicles started. By early January 1945, as American forces counterattacked and German forces withdrew, the mobility differential had become absolute. American units advanced through the same snow and ice the German units were retreating through, but they advanced faster and more sustainably. They could pursue because they had the vehicles to pursue with. The Germans could only retreat as quickly as their feet could carry them, abandoning vehicles when they ran out of fuel, abandoning wounded when they couldn't evacuate them, collapsing back toward the Rhine in an increasingly disorganized rout. The Ardennes offensive, meant to exploit American mobility weaknesses, instead demonstrated conclusively that those weaknesses no longer existed. American logistics had matured to the point where even winter in the Ardennes couldn't stop them. Endgame. Into Germany, in the final months of the war, the Kubelwagen and the Jeep came to represent two nations at opposite ends of their trajectories. The Kubelwagen, still mechanically sound in principle, had become a symbol of scarcity and desperation. Wehrmacht units hoarded them, used them sparingly, mourned their loss like the death of comrades. They were no longer merely vehicles. They were irreplaceable links to a mobility that was slipping away, physical manifestations of a Germany that was running out of everything except determination. The Jeep, conversely, had become ubiquitous to the point of invisibility. It was everywhere, doing everything, treated with casual indifference. American soldiers spray-painted them, decorated them, named them, crashed them, and requested replacements without guilt. Journalist Ernie Pyle, traveling with American units through Germany in March 1945, wrote, "The Jeep is to this army what the sword was to the Crusaders, the essential tool of their trade. But unlike a sword, which a knight would name and treasure, the Jeep is disposable. Soldiers love them in a way, the way you love a loyal dog, but if one is destroyed, there's always another." This casualness toward equipment that costs thousands of dollars to produce reveals something about America that makes Europeans uncomfortable. We waste with a generosity that looks like madness, until you realize there's more where that came from. German civilians watching American forces enter their towns and cities in spring 1945 were often struck by the vehicles before anything else. The sheer number of them, columns that would take hours to pass, jeeps interspersed with trucks and tanks and half-tracks, all moving with a mechanical inevitability that seemed beyond human scale. Frau Elisabeth Schmidt, a schoolteacher in Würzburg, recorded in her diary on April 3, 1945, "The Americans entered today. What struck me first was how many vehicles they have. Every soldier seems to ride rather than walk. Their small cars are everywhere, carrying supplies, towing guns, racing up and down the streets delivering messages. I watched one driver park his car carelessly, half on the sidewalk, and walk away without locking it, or even seeming concerned it might be stolen. This carelessness bothers me more than the occupation itself. They treat valuable equipment like trash. But then, I suppose if you have so many cars that you don't bother to park them properly, you have already won the war." She was right. The war had been won, not in any single battle, but in the accumulated effects of 10,000 logistical advantages, each small, none individually decisive, but together insurmountable. The Jeep was one thread in that tapestry of material superiority. It had mattered in North Africa, allowing reconnaissance deeper and supply closer. It had mattered in Russia, providing mobility when everything else bogged down. It had mattered in France, enabling the pursuit that turned retreat into rout. It had mattered in the Ardennes, maintaining cohesion during crisis. And it had mattered in Germany, projecting power into every corner of a collapsing Reich. Not through dramatic action, there were no battles won by jeeps charging enemy lines, but through the quiet, persistent capability to keep armies moving when movement was necessary. The reckoning Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, whom we left beside his broken Kubelwagen in the Ardennes fog in January 1945, survived the war. He was captured that morning by American troops, spent 6 months in a POW camp in Belgium, and returned to Germany in November 1945. In 1954, he purchased a used Volkswagen Beetle, the civilian vehicle whose design had spawned the Kubelwagen. He drove it for 15 years and maintained it meticulously, just as he'd been trained. It never failed him, because he never asked it to do anything it wasn't designed to do. Corporal James Whitmore returned to Pennsylvania in November 1945 and used his GI Bill benefits to open a garage. He bought a surplus Jeep at auction in 1946 for $278 and used it for the next 20 years as a work truck, driving it until the frame finally cracked from fatigue in 1966. When he replaced it, he bought a civilian Jeep CJ5 because nothing else felt right. Neither man thought much about their vehicle's broader significance. They'd been tools, necessary implements of a terrible time. But the vehicles themselves had been arguing a philosophical point throughout the war, a debate between two visions of how to build things and what values to embed in machinery. The German vision prized efficiency, elegance, and theoretical perfection. The American vision prized redundancy, robustness, and practical sufficiency. The war had been a test of those philosophies under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The test had concluded, not with declarations or treaties, but with the simple fact that one vehicle could cross nearly any terrain in 15 minutes, while the other got stuck trying. This was the truth, that technical manuals and propaganda speeches couldn't change, that theoretical elegance meant nothing when you were buried axle-deep in Belgian mud, watching your enemy drive past you through the same mud without slowing down. That fuel economy didn't matter if you couldn't reach the fuel dump. That precision engineering was useless if you lacked the tools and specialists to maintain it under field conditions. The Jeep had won not through superiority in any single specification. The Kubelwagen was lighter, more fuel-efficient, faster on pavement, but through a combination of attributes that taken together, proved more valuable than optimization. It was the mechanical embodiment of a particular approach to problem solving. Build it tougher than necessary. Make it simple enough that anyone can fix it. Produce enough that losses don't matter. And trust ordinary people to figure out how to use it effectively. These were democratic principles made manifest in steel and rubber, and they had proven more durable than the aristocratic principles of specialized excellence that the Kubelwagen represented. Epilogue: The language of machines. There is a photograph taken in Berlin in July 1945 that circulates in military history books without attracting much attention. It shows a Soviet soldier standing beside a captured American jeep outside the ruins of the Reichstag. The jeep is dusty, dented, clearly well used. Its windshield is cracked. One fender is crushed, but the soldier is smiling, and painted on the jeep's hood in Cyrillic letters is a phrase that translates roughly as, "This one won't quit." That photograph captures something essential about how the war was won. Not through spectacular victories or brilliant generalship, though those played their roles, but through the grinding, persistent application of material superiority so overwhelming that exceptional skill and determination on the other side became irrelevant. The jeep was a small part of that superiority, measured in fractions of a percent of total American war production. But it was a visible part, the part that German soldiers saw driving past them on roads they couldn't reach, the part that appeared in places it shouldn't be able to go, the part that just wouldn't quit no matter how much you wanted it to. Machines speak a language older than words. A language of capability and limitation, of what is possible and what is not. The Kubelwagen spoke fluently of German engineering tradition. Efficient, elegant, precise, optimized for known conditions. The jeep spoke in a different dialect, crude, overbuilt, indifferent to elegance, optimized for the unknown. In 1939, reasonable people might have expected the German language to prove more persuasive. It had all the vocabulary of modern warfare, all the grammar of mechanized combat that had developed since 1918. But warfare is a conversation between industrial systems as much as between armies. And in that conversation, the side that can say, "I have more, I can build more, I can waste more, and I still have more," holds an advantage that tactical brilliance struggles to overcome. The jeep, with its ubiquity and its casual disposability and its stubborn refusal to acknowledge terrain as an obstacle, spoke that language of abundance with an American accent that echoed across continents. In the end, it didn't matter that the Kubelwagen was lighter, or that it used less fuel, or that it embodied elegant engineering solutions to complex problems. What mattered was that it got stuck and the jeep didn't. What mattered was that when one broke, there was another to replace it, and another after that, stretching back to assembly lines in Toledo that produced one every 90 seconds for 4 years. What mattered was that ordinary men could drive it across impossible terrain and keep it running with nothing but basic tools and determination. This was the mathematics of industrial warfare made simple. The side that can keep moving wins. The side that gets stuck loses. And no amount of tactical virtuosity changes that equation. The jeep could cross any terrain in 15 minutes. The Kubelwagen got stuck. The rest was aftermath. The long collapse of a system that had optimized itself for a war it imagined but couldn't fight, against an opponent who simply built more of everything and refused to accept that anything was impossible. That refusal, that democratic insistence that ordinary people with adequate tools can accomplish anything, was encoded in every jeep that rolled off American assembly lines. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It was something more subtle and more powerful, a mobile repudiation of the idea that excellence requires hierarchy, that quality demands aristocracy, that superiority belongs to self-proclaimed master races. The jeep said, "Give a farm boy from Kansas the right vehicle, and he'll drive to Berlin. Give him enough fuel, and he won't stop until he gets there." Tell him it's impossible, and he'll do it anyway, because he doesn't know enough to believe you. This was the voice of a democracy at war, speaking through machinery, and it spoke loudly enough that 60 million people heard it, from the Ardennes to the Elbe, from Tunisia to the Alps. It spoke in the language of engines that wouldn't quit, and tires that found traction where none should exist, and vehicles that kept running because quitting simply wasn't built into their design. And in that language, simpler than strategy and more fundamental than tactics, was the truth that decided the war. You cannot defeat an opponent who treats the impossible as merely inconvenient, who builds machines that embody that attitude, and who produces those machines in numbers too vast to count. The Jeep crossed the terrain. The Kubelwagen got stuck. Everything else was details.